The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents On Evidence. Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. This is a video that I've been piecing together for a while because we often ask people on the various call-in shows and sometimes during debates, which by the way, I think those things are very different. What evidence can you present for your position? And how strong is that evidence? What counts as evidence? And so quite often someone will give a quick definition of evidence or a quick explanation of what they consider evidence by saying, evidence are those facts that are consistent with a proposition. And the problem is that's not a very good definition of very good evidence. Because there are plenty of facts that are consistent with a proposition. And by proposition, we're saying, here's an observation. I propose that this is the explanation for that observation. We found an empty wallet. I propose you stole my money. We find a dead body. I propose the butler killed them. Whatever the proposition is, that's the thing we're trying to demonstrate is most probable or most likely true. And we cannot go merely with facts that are consistent with, but we need facts that point towards that one proposition or a category of propositions in order to narrow things down, showing that they are the most probable. In mathematics, there's a concept of proof, which is different from the colloquial usage of the word proof. And I tend to avoid the word proof entirely. I will, on social media, when somebody says something, I will say, prove it. And what I mean in a colloquial sense is, can you give a demonstration specifically that you have evidence for your proposition? Sufficient evidence to warrant not only you accepting it, but me accepting it, or any reasonable person accepting it. And so in the colloquial sense, we'll talk about proving it. But quite frankly, we get tied down in discussions on the call-in shows with, well, what do you mean by evidence? Or why doesn't this count as evidence? And there are people who think they can get to absolute certainty. I don't see any path to absolute certainty anywhere. And I don't see that it's a problem, because to whatever degree reason is reliable and inviolate, that would be the maximum certainty we could ever possess. And it's good enough. It's good enough for most stuff. Do I have absolute certainty that this computer in front of me isn't going to explode and engulf everything in this room in fire before the end of the video? No, I don't. But I find it incredibly unlikely. And there's no reason to suspect that there is sufficient evidence to warrant such a conclusion. It might happen. It might not. What about things that are even less likely? Like, do I have any reason to believe that I could remove my freshly cleaned glasses and see and read my notes clearly, that my eyes will have seemingly miraculously improved and no longer need corrective lenses? There are claims about things like that happening. I'm not aware of anything like that happening. And we don't really have sufficient evidence that things like that are happening. So what does it mean when we say what counts as good evidence? What should be sufficient evidence? If it's not facts consistent with something, why does it need to be facts that point towards one proposition? Because facts that point to many different propositions are useless. The whole point is to try to figure out which of the proposed explanations for an observation is true. So the facts need to point to one proposition or one category of proposition more strongly than it would to others. It needs to be more consistent with that. There are facts consistent with the claim that you scammed me. I sent you money for a thing and I never received the thing. Therefore, you scammed me. I have evidence. I have evidence because I have my bank account statement that shows that I sent you money, and I have evidence because I never received the thing. All right. How do you demonstrate to somebody else that you never received it? how do you demonstrate to somebody else that it wasn't lost in transit and that the person didn't scam me, but that some other party involved made an error? When you say that someone's scamming you, you're saying essentially that there was an intent to deceive. Well, I sent emails and I didn't get any replies. Okay, I would agree that while these are weak facts that are merely consistent with the proposition that you scammed someone or someone scammed you, they're not yet at the point where they point to one conclusion more likely than another. And yet the cumulative case of these weak statements can lead to reasonable conclusions. So, for example, just the other day, I have a reptile business. We keep and breed a variety of snakes and lizards, and I have to occasionally buy and interact with people online. And there are plenty of people out there attempting to scam others. And so what happened in one case, I wasn't the party who got scammed, but I'll tell you the story of one who was. They posted a particular type of snake for sale. They included a photograph. They had a Facebook page with pretty good information and reviews. There's a phone number. There's a website. And all of that gets you past the, is this a scam surface level test, but not enough to know, hey, is this legit? And so the question becomes, what information would you need to show that this person is scamming or attempting to scam you? Well, in this case, the person who was trying to buy the item thought that the deal was maybe a little too good, but not so good that you went, ooh, this is too good to be true. Didn't like some of the answers that they were getting back when asking questions about the animals. Did a reverse image search on the pictures of the animal and found that they belonged to and had been posted by somebody else. They then contacted that site, and rather than that site actually saying, oh, no, we bought them from that person, or here's the explanation for those pictures or whatever else, they just blocked them. As soon as they were challenged on, are you a scammer? Block. Now, we are really close to having a really solid case that this is an individual who is attempting to deceive. Because someone like me, who's running a legitimate business, who someone comes up and says, oh, you scammed me, we're going to be working to clear the air, to make it right, to offer some sort of compensation, or point out that this wasn't actually the case, that this wasn't a scam. So a bunch of facts that were consistent with you scammed me, that on their own did not and would not warrant reaching that conclusion, as a cumulative effort, did. There's nothing wrong with building a cumulative case. It is just more effort, and it is often weaker because there are still things that we don't know. There are gaps in the story. It's like using triangulation to measure the distance to something. We'll take a measurement from this angle, take a measurement from this angle, take a measurement from this angle, and that will help us triangulate the actual position. How far is it from there to here? Well, it depends on where here is and where there is. Are things moving? So if you go and just hit various dictionaries, dictionary.com, Oxford English Dictionary, I don't know which ones, you'll find definitions for the word evidence that say things like that which tends to prove or disprove something. And I would agree that, generally speaking, evidence is what we rely on to prove or disprove something in a colloquial sense. The difference between what counts in science as evidence, what counts in court as evidence, also depends on what the claim is. Because remember, all of this is with respect to some proposition, some claim. I am claiming you scammed me. I am claiming God is real. I am claiming Jesus rose from the dead. I am claiming the universe was created by an intelligence. When you are presented with the proposition first thing to do is to clear up terms. Because if somebody says the proposition is God exists, we need to know, what do you mean by God and what do you mean by exist? Because to me, existence is necessarily bound to space-time. And so I don't understand claims that something exists outside of space-time, and you would need to spend some time actually explaining how that works and how you know it works and why it's reasonable to believe. But whether you're claiming God exists or rain is magically created in the sky out of nothing, you need to define the terms. Like, oh, we're talking about an all-powerful being that created something, or we're talking about drops of water form out of absolutely nothing somewhere up in the clouds. Then you can start listing facts which are consistent or seem to be consistent with the proposed explanation. But then you have to categorize those facts. Because facts that are consistent with multiple contradictory proposals should be devalued and reevaluated. Hang on, Matt. What? You're saying you should devalue facts that are consistent with multiple propositions? Yes. Because if we find a dead body, that is a fact. We do not yet know whether this individual was murdered or not. We need additional evidence beyond there is a dead body. We need specific facts that may be on the body. There may be bloodstains. It could be fingerprints. It could be, poison, things that don't occur naturally and all this stuff. So you put together all those facts, and then the ones that can point to multiple propositions, those get devalued. They don't get dismissed necessarily, but they get devalued. So if the facts are consistent with the butler did it, the maid did it, and natural causes, that is not a particularly useful fact. It's not an evidence. It's not a piece of evidence for any of those propositions. It may not be a piece of evidence for any specific proposition, because the bit of evidence as you've defined it isn't specific enough to lead to a conclusion about a proposition. So evidence for a proposition are facts exclusively tied to that proposition. Doesn't fit anything else. But much in the same way that we cannot necessarily reach absolute certainty, we may not ever be able to have a piece of evidence that exclusively points to one proposition. And that's got a lot to do with how we define things, how we describe things, and how we think about things. Some evidence is stronger than others. The more strongly, the better the evidence, the more strongly it points to one conclusion, the better the evidence should be considered. And the fact that we can't get to certainty and we can't get to exclusivity doesn't mean that we can't get to good enough. Weaker evidence needs to be devalued and useless facts discarded. The fact that there is an empty wallet isn't evidence that I spent the money. It isn't evidence that there was ever money in there. It isn't evidence that somebody stole the money. It isn't evidence for anything other than the prima facie thing: this wallet contains no money. So you get rid of that to declutter the field. Some evidence being stronger than others is important. You don't have to have a numerical value on it, but you have to realize that having someone say, "Ooh, I heard someone else describe what they saw," is a different strength of evidence for any proposition than "I saw this." When somebody says, "I heard someone say they saw this," and someone else says, "I saw this," the one that saw it is the stronger evidence. Doesn't mean either of them are strong enough to reach a conclusion. And while one of them can be devalued, it doesn't mean that it should be dismissed. Because eyewitness testimony is still frequently unreliable. And what you really want to know is what they saw, but you want to be careful to not get what they interpreted or how they interpreted what they saw. And so if somebody says, "I saw an alien spacecraft," that's more likely to be descriptive of what they interpreted. A more accurate description might be, I saw some lights in the sky moving in a way that was inconsistent with my understanding of what is possible for humans. Or I saw lights in the sky moving in a way that was inconsistent with my understanding of what is possible in the real world. And when you phrase it like that, now all of a sudden the points of attack in the evidence become more obvious. Well, this is contingent on what the person understands about reality. Is their understanding of what is possible accurate? Is their understanding of what humans can do relevant? Because seeing lights in the sky doesn't necessarily mean the options are human or alien. And so when you're listening to someone describe what they saw, the questions that you should be asking yourself about that is, how accurately are they describing what they saw versus how much narrative and conclusion drawing are they injecting into a description of what they saw? There are unreliable narrators. There are people who lie. There are people who are confused. There are people who are making every effort to be as honest as possible, but simply lack the understanding to describe something in a way where it is useful in guiding towards a conclusion. And that is incredibly frustrating and common. And I think that it's a barrier that's come up in many of the shows that we've done, where we ask somebody to call in and present the evidence for their beliefs, the conclusions that they've drawn. They provide what they think is evidence, what they think is good evidence. And when we push back on it, it gets to a point where they don't have the understanding of some underlying issue, the nature of evidence, the narrative account, and how much they're injecting. They just don't understand. And so they sit there and they think they're being both honest and incredibly accurate, but describing an experience is difficult, in part because you're also describing a memory of an experience. And we know that the memory is malleable. And the more often you've brought this up and relived it, it may be that that makes it more reliable because you're constantly refreshing it, or it may be that you are constantly massaging it into a completely different story. How prone is someone to exaggeration? How prone is someone to confusion? How likely are they to seek clarity and acknowledge, ooh, I'm not saying that what I saw was an alien spacecraft. I'm just saying I saw some lights and they moved in a way that I can't describe, that I can't understand. Great. If that's the best you can describe, then that is insufficient to warrant a conclusion about what you actually saw. And so the correct answer then, as it is for most things, is I don't know. We are at a point where we don't have enough information to reach a conclusion. It would be a mistake. It would be a failure of good skeptical principles, of good epistemology, of good, standards of evidence to say that we can reach a conclusion. Now, when I talked about weaker evidence being devalued but not dismissed, it's because cumulative devalued evidence can strengthen a case if there are also bits of evidence that are stronger. Some strong evidence that would be insufficient on its own might be bolstered by cumulative devalued facts. This is why we have different standards of evidence in courtrooms. You have to prove this to a preponderance of the evidence, to a reasonable certainty, beyond a reasonable doubt. When we're looking at things from a scientific perspective, in the hard sciences, well, things are more hard. They're more solid. And so the case is, hey, it either went past this point or it didn't. And if it didn't go, and we can sometimes define those. We have things that are potentially measurable, but in our daily interactions, the way we walk through life, we're not doing that. And what ends up happening is that because it is fair for cumulative devalued evidence to come into play and provide some extra support for better evidence. Sometimes we just get lazy and skip the better evidence and just say, you know what? I've got 500 accounts of this. That's enough. But the plural of anecdote isn't data. And even if 500 people tell you, I saw an alien spacecraft, you would need to investigate further and ask them, all right, let's talk specifics about what you saw so that we can distinguish between, I walked up to a metal structure and it opened up and little gray men walked out with big almond eyes. And they said, hi, we're from another planet. We are using a, blah, 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 blah. And then they got back in their spacecraft, took off and zoomed away in a way that could, that is a different story than I saw lights in the sky. Therefore, I saw an alien spacecraft. What would happen though, if you had 500 people that all told this story about, hey, this is what we all saw? How do you explain that? Was it at the same time? Were they all together? Those would be much stronger narrative, much stronger evidence of 500 people sitting in one room seeing something, until you realize that that happens at magic shows all the time. People witness all kinds of wild things, even in groups. And in some cases, there's an intention to deceive, as would be the case with a magic show. And in other cases, there's not. There's just honest confusion, because we are creatures with similar brains trying to solve similar problems. 1 billion people telling you that they believe God cured them of something isn't evidence for anything beyond 1 billion people claim to believe that God cured them. It doesn't tell you anything at all about whether or not their belief about this is right. Because 1 billion people can be, have been, and are currently wrong about something, probably many things. Probably everybody is wrong about many things. So your sincere belief isn't the evidence. That's the claim you're trying to justify. In the magic community, sorry for any spoilers, there's a concept of closing doors. If you're doing let's say a multi-phase routine, when you're designing it, you can put yourself in the audience's mindset to say, ooh, at this point, I've produced a coin. I produced another coin. I produced another coin. And by the way, there's a video of Teller describing this exactly. And at this point, people in the audience are essentially saying, oh, well, he's just got coins in his hand. So you close that door by holding the last coin from your hand like this. And then you can go on and they'll go to other possible ways to solve the problem. Oh, well, they're coming out of the sleeve. So you take the jacket off. And so you were getting loads from your jacket, you were getting loads from your hands, you were getting loads from wherever. And then you shut those doors until there's nothing left for them to conclude, given how we tend to think about things, other than, wow, this was just magic. This is intentional deception, and you can use a bunch of different methods to achieve the same thing. And so you shut those doors in order to achieve a greater deception in the long run. Con artists do exactly the same thing. They get you to think, why would he lie? Why would he have a suitcase of money? Why would he be coming to me instead of, some bank or some investment thing? It's, oh, I've got $1 million sitting over here, but I'm persona non grata at the bank or at the casino, or I know how to beat the casino, or I know how to I've got insider information on trading, all of this, but I can't do it. So I'm going to have you, give me money to give my friend to do this because I don't have the money to do it. There's a way to build confidence for any of these stories. My empty wallet isn't evidence for the proposition that you stole the money, and it's not evidence that you forgot to send a super chat. It's a fact consistent with those propositions, but it's also consistent with I spent the money, or I took the money out to make a point, or there wasn't any money in there to begin with. And so documenting the chain of custody for evidence is one critical step in proper investigation, basically vetting the evidence, vetting the claim. That ensures that we've reduced the likelihood that mistakes or dishonesty have tainted that evidence to give it the wrong impression, to make it seem stronger than it is in indicating for a particular proposition. So do you have evidence for your belief? What is that evidence, and what methods did you use to verify the accuracy of that evidence? Is that evidence consistent with other claims? The butler did it, the maid did it, a stranger did it, you lost the money. An empty wallet is consistent with all of those things, which means it's evidence for none of them. A dead body isn't evidence for a murder or a specific murderer, but other facts might be. Evidence needs to be specific and as narrow as possible. The more narrow, the better. When we have these conversations, people are like, look at the trees. Wait, what is it you're suggesting? There's a shorthand taking place here that is basically saying the only reasonable explanation for a tree is that it was designed by God, not that it was naturally occurring. But they don't say that because that would expose the proposition itself and how they haven't actually provided evidence. Look at the trees is the claim. The claim being trees require some sort of intelligent creator. What's your evidence? Well, something can't come from nothing. Well, whether or not something can come from nothing isn't even necessarily a fact, depending on definitions of something and nothing. If you talk to some physicists, the way they define nothing in physics is not the same way as the philosophical nihilo of absolute nothingness that isn't a thing and can't be a thing. And so even in the simple sense of something can't come from nothing, yes, now demonstrate that there was ever a nothing that something supposedly came from. How do you do that? And especially for the people who are advocating that something can't come from nothing, therefore it all had to come from God. But if God exists, then nothing doesn't. And so you're just saying, oh, something came from God. But your argument for why you can conclude it came from God is that it can't have come from nothing. Yes, but could it have always been here in some form or another? Could it be the case that there is a universe-generating multiversal contraption, or that some other agent started a series of things, doesn't actually qualify as a God, doesn't even exist anymore, and yet is responsible for this? Yes, but how did that being begin? Eventually they get back to magic. Well, there's just no way this all happened by accident. That's not evidence. Even if you're right that something couldn't happen by accident, which I don't know how you demonstrate that. Depends very much on the claim. That isn't a piece of evidence. Push back on all of the claimed bits of evidence, and you'll find that it's sloppy thinking, that it's hyperbole, that it's skipping a few steps, that it's personal incredulity, and none of it is strong evidence that would be useful in triangulating towards a specific proposition to explain an observation. It's an attempt to pretend that they've offered some defense, when they're really trying to put up a facade in order to shift the burden of proof to you, in order to try to show that they're wrong and that they should keep believing it until you disprove them, which is not only not good evidence, it's wholly unreasonable and fallacious. So evidence for a proposition are those facts that are as close to exclusively identifying a specific proposition as we can possibly attain. And the threshold for determining when the evidence is sufficient is going to be different based on the claim. How much evidence already exists in the world that the claim might be true? How much new evidence do we need? Where do you personally draw the line on becoming convinced? And for me, while that line isn't well defined, we can have discussions about that line. If you're drawing the line at somebody said, therefore I believe, we can demonstrate that that evidence could lead to a number of different conclusions, and therefore you are picking a preferred one for some bias that isn't tied to the evidence. It would be like if I rolled a die and it came up with a 4, and you decided that it came up with a 3, and your evidence was that I rolled a die. Yes. What is the barrier? What is the threshold for determining that evidence, even good evidence, is sufficient? Because one good piece of evidence may not be sufficient to warrant a claim. And so the question I ask myself is, how far have we narrowed things so that this evidence that I'm pointing to actually points to the conclusion that I'm going to accept tentatively? Because the more likely it is to be wrong, the more likely it could be that there are facts missing or facts that would move the needle in a different direction, the more I should say, this could be the case. I think this could probably be the case. I think this possibly could be the case. I am tentatively convinced that this is the most probable solution. But we don't tend to think in those terms all the time. It's, oh, this person told me something, I trust it, they wouldn't lie. As if lying is the only option for an error in reporting. Where you draw the line is, of course, up to you. But where you draw the line can be wrong if, in fact, you care about the likelihood that your beliefs are correct. And that's something I think we can evaluate. It has to be done on a case-by-case basis. And while we can apply those conclusions to similar categories of claims, we have to do it with caution and not just say, well, in the same way that this fact is consistent with this conclusion is a little bit like this one over here, so I'm just going to believe both of them. That way lies disaster. See you next time.